Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Today we're going to talk about 3, maybe 4, kind of in between the crack Blue Note artists in the 4000 sequence. And I've covered the 1500 sequence quite a lot recently, so we're not going to touch on those guys. There's some obscure titles there as well, but as I've said many times, obscure Blue Note titles are kind of tough to come by. There's so much light shed on the label and so much publicity and so much prestige associated with Blue Note that pretty much all the titles in the 1500 series and the 4000 series up to the sale has been reissued quite a lot. If you join any of those Facebook jazz groups, you'll see most of these records posted pretty non-stop. Especially your Jackie McLean's and your Hank Mobley's and your Lee Morgan's, Jazz Messengers. That stuff gets posted pretty much all the time. Even Andrew Hill and Herbie Hancock, like most of that era, that whole decade, it's pretty well proliferated throughout the jazz community. There are a few artists and titles, however, that do seem to get a lot less love than others. And some of that's a little intriguing and mysterious and hard to explain, but it is what it is. The first guy I want to talk about today is Walter Davis Jr., who I often get confused with Walter Bishop, but Walter Davis Jr. is a fantastic young player. Part of his fame was he was a jazz messenger, 1959, 1960. That puts him in the Jazz Messengers in between Sam Dockery in that non-Blue Note era, 1957, when they were on all those different labels. That band gets a lot less notoriety than the Blue Note stuff before and after. The Blue Note stuff gets so much more light shed on it. But that Sam Dockery, Spanky DeBrest, Johnny Griffin lineup, there were some great groups, some great records, some great driving, propulsed Blakey music in 57 into 58. And he comes back to Blue Note, and Bobby Timmons is about to take that chair, but Walter Davis gets in the group for parts of 59 and 1960. I believe he was on the album Africane. I believe he's on the album Witch Doctor on those sessions, both of which come out later in the Blue Note discography after the sale, which is part of why I think Davis goes under the radar some. Davis was born in, I believe, Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. He plays with Babs Gonzalez early on in the late 40s, and Babs was an interesting kind of street poet, jazz beatnik kind of character who I mistook for a woman for years, Babs Gonzalez. But it's really a kind of an eccentric black street poet in a sense. In the early 50s, he's playing with Max Roach and Charlie Parker. So Davis has some early street credential. He plays a hard-driving bebop and a very expressive hard bop. He's a great player. In 56 era, he's working with Dizzy Gillespie while he's at Verve on records like Dizzy and Grease and Statesman of the Year kind of things. He works with Donald Byrd in Paris in 58 for a brief moment. As I said, in 59, he joins the Jazz Messengers in between Dockery and the great Bobby Timmons, who takes over the chair by the time Moaning comes along. And of course, Timmons has great regard, and most of the other Jazz Messengers have a lot of fame compared to Walter Davis Jr. He ends up quitting jazz and music for quite a while and becomes a tailor and a painter and a designer. It didn't say what he designed, but he was a designer of something. And he ends up coming back to jazz in the 70s, works with Sonny Rollins and Sonny Christ in the late 60s actually, but he doesn't have the recognition that most other Blue Note artists get. And this one record he does as a leader, Davis Cup, is a fantastic record. Of course, the Japanese pressing here with Donald Byrd, Jackie McLean, Sam Jones, and the great Art Taylor. So it's a Blue Note pedigree record. It's full of propulsed grooves and great playing by all members of the group. Walter Davis was known to be able to kind of disseminate some of Bud Powell's playings and put that into his own stylings. And he was also able to do Monk and channel Monk at times, which is a great lineage. You know, Powell and Monk were definitely co-influencing each other at the time. with Powell having far more intricate, long flowing lines, and of course Monk being more the choppy, blocky, dissonant angles and slices of sound. And they both borrow from each other, as does other players. Like, of course, Herbie Nichols is part of that sound and borrows some of those same innovations. But Walter Davis ends up being part of that lineage as well, although he's far less recognized for that. He ends up playing with other people like Teddy Edwards. Plays with, like I said, Dizzy Gillespie, Julian Priester, Hank Mobley, Jackie McLean, Philly Joe Jones, Slide Hampton, Charlie Rouse, and of course Art Taylor. So he plays with some pretty big, luminous names in the time frame we're speaking of. And how he slips through the cracks some. And I'm sure his original record only sold, 5,000-6,000 copies maybe. Those early Blue Notes didn't sell extremely well. And I think Alfred Lion and Frank Wolf and Walter Davis too would be surprised to see the fame and legacy and prestige of Blue Note 40, 50, 60 years later. And it's kind of odd that the Blue Note label is best described today with the name of their biggest competitor at the time, Prestige. But the Prestige catalog has some prestige around it, but it's Blue Note that has the prestige today. It's filled with a legacy that is boldly advertised across the jazz industry and the music industry, and even a lot of non-jazz people. The name Blue Note has some ring to it. They might not be able to even name a Blue Note record. The non-jazz community doesn't have a lot of knowledge of jazz beyond being able to say maybe Miles Davis and maybe John Coltrane, but they couldn't probably name a record by Coltrane. They'd probably be surprised if you played My Favorite Things for them and said, yeah, that's John Coltrane. They'd be like, oh, I've always liked this. I've always hummed along to it. Miles Davis, like I said, Kind of Blue gets into a lot of collections that aren't jazz collections, but the average non-jazz person can name his name, and that's kind of the extent. And of course, Armstrong has a big, luminous legacy as well that non-jazz people are aware of Louis. My brother Paul, who's not really a music guy, knows who Louis Armstrong is. I use him as a great measuring stick of how popular is jazz. All three of my brothers, for that example, for that matter. But my brother David has more exposure to music and more openness to music, so he knows a few more levels. But my brother Paul and even Tim's actually my youngest brother has a lot of musicality, and he's a musician, and so he's more receptive to when I say, hey, check out some Grant Green. He's a guitar player, check out some Wes Montgomery. So jazz is just so on the periphery of most people's comprehension of music. It's something that's historic to them, that in the average person's mindset is just about virtuosity and mathematics. And I think the perceptions of jazz today are very incorrect. And I think that's one of the things I've always set out to do, is try to remind people that jazz was a popular, fun music long before it became the complex, unorganic thing that it becomes at the end that most people seem to remember it for. It's like you spend your whole life doing good things, and then at the end you remember for one chapter that doesn't really measure up to the body of work that you were a part of. So anyway, Walter Davis is a great player. This record's a great record. It's firmly entrenched in that Blue Note Jazz Messenger tree of life. And as I said, the Blue Note sound, especially 56 through 61, 62, it is the Jazz Messengers and the associated acts that come from that clique. So check out Walter Davis. And there's, like I said, there's a few records of the Jazz Messengers where he's on. I just don't think any of them actually were released in the time frame of the Blue Note original sequence. But even like that non-Blue Note Jazz Messenger 57, early 58 lineups on Pacific, on Jubilee, on so many different labels, honestly. Elektra, they had a record. There's a real lack of exposure for those records. They go for a fraction of what the Blue Note stuff does that comes after. And even the live Blue Note stuff that comes out for the Jazz Messengers in 55 and 56 and the Columbia stuff in 56 gets far more exposure and has far more regard in the jazz community than that stuff that came out in 57 with that great lineup that really kind of is under the radar in a lot of senses. So that's Walter Davis Jr., worth checking out. The next guy I want to talk about is a great little player on the alto, a guy by the name of Sonny Red. And this one's been reissued on Classic Records, and Tone Poet might have even redone it if I recall. So it's actually gotten a little more luminosity in these last few years. But Sonny Red's a guy that's really been on the periphery of jazz most of his career and has never really gotten much of the credit or recognition for his stylings and contributions that he made. He comes to the scene initially with Barry Harris, both of them being Detroit natives. In the late 40s, they're playing around Detroit. He's born Sylvester Kiner, and that's a pretty cool name. And perhaps if you'd remained Sylvester Kiner, your name might have had more infamy to it. The name Sonny Red kind of blends into the background with the Freddie Reds and the Sonny Rollins and Sonny Paynes, and there's so many Sonnies in jazz that Sonny Red kind of gets lost in the mix. He's born December 17, 1932, as I said, in Detroit, which is one of the great hotbeds of jazz talent. And it's really nothing more to that than the fact Detroit had a huge black population. Being the center of the American auto industry for all those 20th century decades, the black migration as it came up north through the railways in the Mississippi into the heartland and the Rust Belt, all those industrial cities, few of them had more work than Detroit had to offer. That was often union jobs and paid well. It led to a wealthy black middle class in Detroit that little of the rest of America ever saw. You know, there was work in Chicago, there was work in Pittsburgh and Dayton and Cleveland, and a lot of these industrial cities had work, but Detroit had good work. And so it led to a really large black population. Black colleges sprung up in Detroit. Before most of the places, there was a large a selection of black schools and trade schools that young blacks could go to. So there was opportunity in Detroit that just kept bringing in the migrants from across the country. And it's that and that alone that creates this incredible pool of talent music-wise in Detroit. And you see that springboard over into rock and roll and R&B and Motown. Detroit was a great center of black music. And even most of the white music that comes out of Detroit is rooted firmly in rhythm and blues. You know, even guys like Ted Nugent, who I wish would never speak in public again, he's rooted in rhythm and blues. He has that black music in him, and he's the first to recognize it. So all his gun rights and crazy conspiracy aside, the Nuge had a black heritage to his sound and what he played, and he's a great player. Kiss, Kid Rock, even Eminem. It goes on down the line. Detroit is just such a fulcrum for a sound of black American music and the diaspora as it spreads around the country. Detroit is that fulcrum where a lot of it really, it's the axis where so much of it originates. But Red and Harris are kind of making a little impression there. He ends up working with Blakey briefly in 1954 in one of the early iterations of the Jazz Messengers. He might even be on that Emercy 10-inch that Blakey does. I'm not sure, but that was in 54. And he makes a record with Art Pepper at Savoy, which is initially on the Regent sister label. And that record, from my understanding, it is two separate sides. I don't think they're playing together. I think one side is Pepper, one side is Sonny Red. But it's a great record. It's worth finding. It has a black and white cover, which is a reissue, second later pressing. The original color cover is pretty tough to come by, and it's definitely worth seeking out if you can find it. I believe Savoy also reissues it as well. So it comes in multiple different packagings, and Savoy was very much a whore in the way they packaged and repackaged their products. He goes to Blue Note, makes this record, and early in the 4000 sequence, so probably late 1958, he makes this great record with Wynton Kelly. And then Sam Jones and Paul Chambers take turns on the bass, and Roy Brooks and Jimmy Cobb take turns on the drums. And like I said, it's been reissued. I believe Tone Poet did last year. And so it has had some luminosity shed on it the last few years. But it's kind of one of those Blue Note titles that really lived in obscurity. It's a great album cover. Like the graphics, the design, the color, the layout. It's something that's so timeless that it could definitely be something an artist put out today in any genre of music. You know, you look at the Savoys and a lot of other labels in that same time frame. Even some of the great album covers, some of the Bethlehem Burt Goldblatt stuff, it still has kind of a vintage era to it. And a lot of this stuff is so modern still that it's really ridiculous that they were able to pull that off, Reed Miles and company. But he works with Curtis Fuller on a number of Curtis Fuller's Prestige, but mostly his Savoy Regent recordings as well. He works with Donald Byrd in 66, 67 on some of his later records like Mustang. They're more rhythm and blues based Blue Note stuff from that late era before the sale. He works with Bill Hardman on that great record in 61, Saying Something, which is also on Savoy, and one of the last really strong Savoy albums that I'm aware of. And I know there's stuff that comes after where I'm familiar with, but a lot of it's very periphery, and the names don't make it in any of the jazz books, and some of it's probably good or even great, but it certainly doesn't have any legacy to it. He also plays with Yusuf Lateef on a few of his records, another Detroit guy, of course, and Frank West. He works with him at Savoy as well in the late 50s. So Sonny Red was an alto player that had a nice tone, could play fairly driving hard bop, but also was very comfortable playing in a more bluesy R&B setting, and was also very fluent on a ballad. You know, so Sonny Red's another guy that we should be looking out for and being aware of. It's amazing how many of these guys really slip into obscurity, and many of them never come back into the limelight. And guys like Walter Davis Jr. and Sonny Red have the benefit of having a Blue Note title with their name on it. And if there's any way to keep you somewhat in the public's eye, and by public I mean the jazz community's public's eye, it's having a Blue Note title with your name on it. Even being a Blue Note sideman is beneficial, but having an actual album with your name on it really propels you to a level of modern day recognition that a lot of artists on Prestige, Savoy, Riverside just don't get. Well, even though ability wise and talent wise and production wise there's a great parallel, it's not like the Blue Note stuff's this much better in any sense. It's just, again, the publicity and the marketing behind it today is so omnipresent that it really never slips too far. The last guy we're going to talk about today is a guy that shouldn't be considered obscure. And his legacy is firmly planted in any jazz textbook, any jazz historian book. Everybody knows Kenny Clarke. If you're firmly entrenched in the history and the lore of jazz, Kenny Clarke, or aka Kluke, was an incredibly important architect of some of the early innovations of bebop. And he helps to define the drums in the new modern era. His driving, propelling ride cymbal, he just had a new way of approaching and dropping the kick drum. So the modern drumming kind of really starts with Max Roach, Kenny Clarke, and Art Blakey. Those three are the bridge between the old sound and way and the modern way of jazz that comes in the late 40s, early 50s. Kenny Clarke's legacy is so interwoven in the fabric of the Savoy Records story. And if you saw my special I did on Savoy Records, a 3-parter, about a month and a half ago, I kept track of every session and the first 100 Savoys that Kenny Clarke was on, and it was about half of them. That's an incredible number of records that the powers that be, Ozzy Cadena, and the leaders at Savoy, Lubinsky was, of course, the owner, but by this time he'd been kind of told to stay out of the way. And they recruited Wendell Marshall on bass, Hank Jones on piano often, but Kenny Clarke was by far the most used of these musicians. All three of them were black guys that played even a lot of the white guy recordings because they knew these guys were going to lay down a solid groove. And it kind of made what the other players were doing, regardless of talent and ability and how groovy or bluesy they were. When you have these guys laying down the pattern, it's going to elevate any player who's playing on top of them and makes anything that those three were on, anything Kenny Clark was on, is of notoriety and worth having. So his body of work is immense as a sideman. And when you go to Wikipedia and look up Kenny Clark's work, 80% of those titles aren't listed. Like, there needs to be some updates on that stuff. His body of work is immense. This is, of course, his one Blue Note with Francis Boland, a European. Kenny, by 58, 59, has had enough of America. He's had enough of race. There's work and opportunity to be had in Europe, where he ends up going for a decade plus. And he spends a lot of time recording over there. He ends up forming the Kenny Clark, Francis Boland big band, and they make records on Atlantic. They make this record here on Blue Note, but they also make a lot of recordings in Europe on European labels. And if you're a European, if you're an American jazz musician who's gone to Europe, this was a great home, kind of feeling comfortable band for you to be a part of while you were there. And so the membership changes quite a lot. There's always European members in the mix, but great Americans who came over were often added to the group while they were in Europe. This is one of the most rare, I think, Blue Note titles, and probably least promoted on a lot of the jazz pages. You just don't see this one shown very often. And I've seen and heard long-time collectors, when someone posts this, going, "Oh, I've never seen that one." And like I said, it's kind of rare in that sense that a Blue Note can be that obscure. And even the Blue Note album cover books make so many of the Blue Note album covers familiar to us. We may never have heard Whistle Stop. We may never have heard Herbs and Roots. We may never have heard the Donald Byrd with the Mustang off to the races. But this one, we know those album covers from those books. This one seems to even miss out on a lot of that publication. And so it's just remained in relative obscurity throughout the decades. And this one has Dusko Gojkovic on it, Raymond Draws, Chris Kellens, Carl Drevo, Derek Humble, Jimmy Wood, who was an American who played with Ellington, and Kenny Clark and Francis Boland. So for the most part, it's European players here with them. Dusko has quite a reputation. I'm not super familiar with his body of work, to be honest, but I do know the name pretty well. The other players I'm not too familiar with at all. Derek Humble sounds like he's a black American as well, but I'm not positive on that. But it's a nice record. It swings hard. He knew how, in the mid-50s to late 50s, to take any group of guys and teach them how to swing. You know, there's instances where he's playing at Savoy with white talent that they're bringing in. And so he was always comfortable in putting a foundation behind any player to make them sound fantastic. And these Europeans sure know how to play. And Clark really is the foundation of most of these sessions, and he's putting down a thunderous groove for all of them to just fall in behind and let him do the heavy lifting, which he's certainly happy to do. So again, this is a record worth looking for. Those few Atlantic titles by these guys are also worth looking for. And if you see the European titles, I'd recommend grabbing those as well. From my understanding, according to Jean-Michel and other people I know, most European jazz fans are pretty familiar with this group. You know, it's the American audience that really kind of isn't that aware of these. And Kenny Clark. Kenny Clark is so deserving of being seen as one of the great luminaries and driving forces, and should be on the tips of our tongue as much as Max Roach, as much as Art Blakey, as much as Philly Joe Jones or Elvin Jones, as much as Roy Haynes. Like, all those names are pretty popular. Kenny Clark somehow seems to be, in popularity and in terms of discussion, not mentioned near as often. And part of that's because he spent so much time in Europe. The American audience doesn't follow that. And again, a guy like Don Byas, who was one of the innovators in the bebop scene, he spent so long in Europe that he was forgotten in America. He came back here and no one even remembered him. which of course is always kind of sad and discouraging. So those are 3 Blue Note titles that I think really get kind of left in the dust somewhat and don't get the popularity and credit that they deserve. And as I said with Prestige and Riverside, those 3 labels especially to me are the cream of the crop from the late 50s, early 60s hard bop, modern era of jazz. Those 3 labels made the most unwatered down, not trying to package it comfortably for consumers. They put black men on the covers. Those record labels were really focused on recording black men and getting that message documented. We may not be able to proliferate it into the cosmic mindset of the people, but we're still going to document it in hopes that maybe someday, and that's what's happened, is that Riverside, Prestige, and especially Blue Note has become far more luminous and far more impactful now than it was at the time. At the time, people were listening to RCA, Capitol Columbia, mainstream white jazz, and those Blue Note records were just obscure. And now the mainstream jazz has become really obscure and no one talks about it, even though some of it's really great and some of it's sold really well, which is why it's less expensive and that's why people don't think it has any value, which it's all kind of silly. But kudos to Blue Note, kudos to Riverside, and even Prestige, Bob Weinstock, who again, his integrity was far lower in terms of his belief in what this music was about. Weinstock was much more just a businessman seeing an opportunity, and he had far less concern about the integrity of a session or how cohesive today's lineup might be. There's 6 guys here, let's just track them. You know, Weinstock was very loose from the hip with how they produced those records. And a lot of those Prestige records suffer from that lack of focus and lack of thought put into them, but they also benefit from that loose setting in the fact that they are just driven by the blues and swing. So they're often very hard swinging records just without a lot of innovation or composition or unified expression, which Blue Note does the best. You know, that Blue Note unity comes across in those records so strongly. So that's 3 Blue Note records I think people should dig into and look for. Tough to find. Tone Poet's slowly putting these rare titles more out into the public realm, and the exposure Tone Poet gives to all those releases is a wonderful byproduct of the affordable, gatefold, lovely packaging. One of the great benefits of this whole thing is the light is shedding on some of the more obscure artists and titles at Blue Note. So it's a great legacy. Kudos to Tone Poet for what they're doing. Like someone else mentioned to me, Music Matters, they're a much smaller company, and they're working on a microscopic budget. And so part of why their costs are so high is that they are a very tightly run small organization, and they have to charge $100 to make their money, which does make sense. It still, to me, is exorbitant to have a $100 record. And it's obviously that a lot of these things are being made for the boutique record consumer. And if that buying base is out there, more power to you. The only problem is sometimes some of these titles are so difficult to find that a consumer who doesn't want to spend $100 has no option but to buy that one on Music Matters for $120. And a lot of those Music Matters will go into the Discogs and eBay stores and be marked up again by 200-300%. And so sometimes it'll be $300 for a record that was issued 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, last year, and they'll be 2 or 3 times the price all of a sudden. You're like, what's going on? That's ridiculous. But money rules the world, as we all know. Y'all be safe. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Stay tuned. We got some fun stuff coming down the channel. Subscribe if you haven't. If you want to go to Patreon and donate a few dollars, that's always appreciated. And if you just want to do a one-time contribution, go to the merchandise store and buy a t-shirt, buy a hoodie, buy a pair of sweatpants. There's some cool designs in there. Probably 4 or 5 different ones at this point. Y'all be safe. Talk to you soon. Peace.